Hey coders, welcome back to part 2 of this amazing series where we are building a REST-style single-page application e-commerce website without any frameworks and libraries, with JavaScript as front-end and PHP as back-end. In previous episode, we built this navigation bar. There is still a little bit of tidying up that we need to do over here, such as these backgrounds that you can see against these categories. They should only be visible when we click on them. But since this logic is going to be defined in the event listener which is associated with these categories, and we yet have to work on that event listener, so for the time being they are going to remain as such. When we finally get to work on that event listener, then we will define the logic which will make these backgrounds only appear and only with the category that has been clicked. With that said, let's start working on our today's objective. So today we are going to start off by creating this footer, and then we'll move on to defining this banner. So let's get to it. Let's go and have a look at the footer and figure out the basic structure of the footer. So our footer consists of at least two children. The first one contains these social share icons, and in the second child we have this help and locations and privacy and legal stuff. So in the first child we are going to define an unordered list, and each of the items in this unordered list is going to contain the font awesome icons for these networks. And likewise for the second child we have three more divs in it. One div consists of this heading help, and these are all list items in the unordered list. Likewise for the second div in the second child, this is heading, and then these are all list items of an unordered list. Third child is also contains a heading, and then these two list items, and the rest is styling. So now let's go and define this footer. So this is our index.html, and as you can see our footer is currently empty. Now let's define two divs in it. The first one is going to be social share, a div with the class name social share, and for the second div let's give it class name journal info. Now let's go to our social share div. Let's define an unordered list. Now over here we need four list items. We can define anchor tags over here such that when we click on them we shall be redirected to another page which contains the information related to this link, such as the Twitter account associated with our website. But since we don't have the social share network, so I'm going to keep it simple, and I'm just going to bring in the font awesome icons over here. We need 5 such list items. I have already created one, so let me create 4 more. Now let's go and bring in the font awesome icons. Let's look for Facebook. Let's choose this one, copy, and paste it over here. Twitter. Okay, we've got all the font awesome icons, and now let's go and have a look in the browser. Let's go to the demo project, and we can see the icons over here. Again, we need to increase their size. fa-2x class with all of these I tags. Okay, that's better. Okay, now let's define the second child of the footer element. So our second div in the footer is got a class name called journal info. Now this div contains 3 divs. The first div has the class name help. Second div has the class name, let's make it store location. And third div, let's give it a name legal. Now let's start working on the help div. The first element in the help div is going to be a h3 element for the heading. So it's help. Now the second child is going to be unordered list. Okay, that's the help part done. Now let's move on to store location. Let's give it h3 locations. Now let's define UL with li. Let's start with London, Paris, New York, Hyderabad. Now let's move on to legal. Again, let's give it h3 tech, privacy, and legal. Now let's define unordered list, cookies, and privacy policy, terms and conditions. That's it. As far as our HTML is concerned for the footer, we are done with that part. Now let's go and have a look in the browser. Okay, so this is how it currently looks, and we have to now define the styling which gives it the appearance of this thing over here. So let's get to it. So the first thing that we need to do is that we have to bring all of these icons in a single row, and likewise for these three divs in the second child, we again have to bring them in the single row. So that means we have to define display property flex for both of these children of the footer. So let's go down, and since we are starting styling for the footer section, so it's better to define some kind of boundaries so that later on when we need to do some modification in the footer section, it's easier to find where does our footer lie in this sea of CSS styles. Let's paste it, and over here and here. Okay, now within these two comments we have to write all the styling that belongs to footer section. So the first thing that we need to do is that we have to define the flex property for both of the children of the footer. So the first child has the class name social share, display flex, and we want these items to be in the center and justified as well in the center. Okay, they haven't come in the center. I wonder why. Oh, that's the reason. So the thing is this, we have another block inside the social share div. We have to define the style property for this unordered list to be flex, not for the div, because the div contains just one child, which is unordered list. It is unordered list whose children we want to be placed in a single row. So let's go and put UL over here. Okay, that's better. Now we need some space between them. So what we are going to do is that copy and li. Let's give it some margin. Margin top, let's give it 0.5%, and the left and right, let's make it 1% and see how it looks. Yep, that's better. We need to remove these dots which appear with every list item, and because this is default style of unordered list, so we have to go up to UL, list style to none. That's better. Now let's go and define the flex property for the second div as well. So the second child is called journal info. Again, display is flex. Let's have a look. Okay, that's great. Now we need some space between these three divs, and to give them space, we have to set its justify contents to be space between. Justify contents to be set to space between. Justify contents space between. Yep. Now we have to set the align items property, and this time we are not going to set it to center, because if we set it to center, so if you look at the third child, it has just two children. So if the align items has been set to center, this third child will look like to be placed in the center with respect to these two. So we want all of these children to start off from the same position or the same horizontal line, and then it won't matter if one of the div has fewer number of children. So align items to, we want it to be, rather than starting from the center, we want them to start from the top position. So the value that we have to use is this one, flex start. Now visually it hasn't had any effect, they still look the same, but it's always better to have a property explicitly specified. Now let's move on to the rest of styling. So let's go to the demo and try to get some clues from there. What shall we do next? So our demo has this background color, and then there is some space between each of these list items. So let's give some background color and then think of how can we put some space between these. So since color is only in the second child, which is journal info, so let's define background color to be, okay. So now we got background color in our second div as well. Now we need to remove these list styles, and then we have to think of placing some space between each of these list items. Since all of these list items are inside this journal info, so we are going to say journal info, then UL. So any unordered list which is inside this journal info div, we are going to set its list style property to none. So this way, this style is going to be applied to all of the 3 unordered lists which are in 3 different divs of this journal info div. Let's change the spelling, otherwise the style will not apply. Okay, brilliant. Now we have to place some space between all of list items. So I'm going to define margin bottom for all of these list items. This way each one will have a bottom margin, and as a result some space between these different elements. So again, since I'm going to apply to all of the list items which are in 3 different unordered lists, so let's copy, paste, and put li over here. Let's remove this thing. Now let's define margin bottom. Let's put temporarily 10 pixels and see how it looks. Let's make it 15 pixels. Good. Now we need to define some margin bottom for our h3 elements as well, so that there is space between this h3 element and the first li element. So again, what we are going to do is that since all of these h3s are within this journal info div, so let's put it over here. Now h3 target, and again margin bottom, let's define the same margin bottom, or maybe some more because it's a heading. Let's make it 25 pixels. Probably we should have some margin top as well. So let's remove this and make it a margin that applies to all 4 sides. So for the top and bottom, I'm going to make it 25 pixels, and left and right I'm going to keep it 0. Okay, that's better. Now if you notice, some of these headings and list items have capital letters and some have small letters, so we have to keep it consistent. So again, we are going to apply text transform and capitalize each of these letters. And since we are going to apply everything inside the journal info, so we need to have this property applied over here, journal info. So this way, no matter how nested a child is inside the journal info, this property is going to be applied to all of them. So text transform, and we are capitalizing it. Okay, that's better. Now we have to figure out how can we make these list items slightly grow in size and change their color when the cursor hovers over them, like this one. So to do that, we are going to use transform property on each list items hover class. So we have list items in both of the children of footer element, which is the journal info child as well as the social share child. So what we are going to do is that since we want this effect to be applied both of these children's list items, so I'm going to define this logic on the footer element itself. So footer, so any list items inside the footer, this should apply to all of those. Over here we have to define transform, and the easiest way is to say that we want this transform property to be applied to all of the styling properties. So this way, any of the values for the set properties for this element changes, then this transform property is going to take effect. Then we want this transformation to take place 2 seconds to complete, and the way it should start and complete is we want this to be ease in out. Means when we move the cursor over it, it will slowly start in, and when we move the cursor away from the element, it will slowly come back to its original form. So over here we have defined how shall this transformation take place, how long should it take, and on which properties change should this transformation be applied. So we are over here saying all. Now again footer li, and this time we are going to capture the hover class. So when we are hovering over this list item, which is inside the footer element, following should happen. So we want to change the color to be the primary color for each of these items. So the color is primary color. The other thing that we want to do is we want the size of these elements to be slightly get bigger, the font size. So we are going to set font size to larger. Now let's have a look. Good. Okay, that's better. So we are done with the styling. The only thing that we need to work on is, since this is a footer, so this is supposed to be always at the bottom of the page. So why do you think this footer is not at the bottom of the page? Well, the reason for the footer being not present at the bottom of the page is that after this header we have main div, but that main div is currently completely empty. So it's not occupying any space on our browser. So that's why the footer is the next thing that comes after main. And since main is not occupying any space, this has made footer get pushed up to the top. So we have to make sure that even if our main is empty, this footer always remains at the bottom. And one of the ways that we can do that is that we have to assign minimum height to our main element. So this way, even if the main element is empty, it will always have certain minimum height. And that will push footer always to the bottom. Let's go and assign this minimum height to our main. Since we are defining main, so it's supposed to come before the footer. So main starts here. Let's give it minimum height, 55% of viewing height, 45. Now if you notice, the contents of journal info div are squashed against the walls of the browser. So we want some padding between the contents and the walls of the browser. So if you remember, we assigned 2% padding to the left and right in the header section. So we have to assign the same kind of padding to this second child of the footer, so that these contents appear to be aligned with the footer contents. So we have to go to the second child of the footer, which is journal info, and we have to give it the same padding that we gave to our heading div in the header section. So the top and bottom we kept it to 0, and for the left and right we made it 2%. Okay, now they seem to be aligned with the contents in the heading div. Now we are done with the header div. We can move on to displaying the banner section. But before we move on to the banner section, there is one more thing I need to sort out before we move on to the banner section. So for that, let's go to the demo project. So if you look at the demo project, now we have this scroll bar. Now even if I scroll down, I will still be able to see the header. And it feels like the product seems to be sliding underneath this header section, and the header section remains fixed there. So currently, this isn't how our header section is going to work if we put some elements in it and we have a scroll bar over here. So once we get scroll bar over here and we scroll it down, then this header section will be pushed up and out of the screen. So to make this header section stick there, we have to set its position property to be fixed. But once we do that, we are going to encounter a new set of problems. So let's go and first set the position property to fix, and from there on we will see how to move forward. So let's go up to the header section. Let's put a comment here. Now over here we have to define styling for the header element itself. So far we have defined styling for its children, but not for the header section itself. So let's set its position to be fixed, and let's go and have a look in the browser. How has this affected in the browser? So as you can see, it appears that whole organization of the elements in the browser seems to have gone haywire. First of all, our header doesn't seem to stretch out throughout the browser width, and our footer have also seemed to have gone up as well. So what could have gone wrong? Well, before we dissect that out, I'm going to assign temporarily a background color to our main section. Now remember, this is going to be a temporary color, just to explain what's happening. Let's give this light salmon color. So this has happened. Now we must be thinking that since we have defined the main element after the heading element, so this color should start from this position, and that will push the main section further down, and eventually that will push the footer section to the place where it was in the beginning. But for some reason, setting the position fixed for our footer element have not only shrunk its size, but it has also brought the main section to start from the very top left corner of the browser. So currently it appears that our main section as well as the header section, they are both starting off from the same position. And since the header is a smaller element, so it's occupying less space, and main section is occupying more space. But they are both starting from the same position. But the way we have defined them in the HTML, clearly our header section comes before the main section. So this should not happen. So what has actually happened is that when we assign a position to any HTML element other than static, which is default, and therefore we never define the position, so that element goes out of the normal flow of the elements in the HTML page. So now the normal flow is, this is the first element and this is the second element in the HTML body element, whereas this header is some rogue element which does not obey the normal flow. But then you must be wondering, if it's a rogue element, so why it has still chosen to start from the top left corner, just as we had initially put it there? Well, that's because once you define a position to be fixed for any element, it will always start off from the top left corner of the browser. So that's why it's starting from the top left corner, because its position is fixed, not because it was the first element in the HTML's body element. So that means if we assign position to be fixed for our footer, this footer will also be placed over here at the top left corner of the browser. So whenever we assign a position fixed to any element, it will always be placed against the browser. So that's why it has come over here. Now the next question is, why is it occupying just 3/4 of the browser width and not the rest? That's because the contents that are in this header element, they are occupying that much space. If they had occupied lesser space, then we would see even a smaller header element. So that leads us to the second part, that once we define a position to be fixed for our any HTML element, we have to define its starting position, where we exactly want to place it with respect to this starting position of the browser, the top left position of the browser. So with respect to that, where do we want to place this element? We have to define those properties or attributes ourselves. So we still want it to be placed where it is placed, but we want it to stretch out throughout the browser width. So therefore, the three properties that we are going to define are, we have to set the top to be at 0, means from the top of the browser, it should start exactly where the browser screen starts. Then left should be 0 and right should also be 0. What this is going to do is that it's going to make the header section stretch out throughout the width of the browser. Nothing has happened. Oh, we have defined these attributes in the main section, whereas we are supposed to define them in the header section. Over here. Test. Brilliant. Now our header section is fixed. There is one more property that we need to define to make sure this header is always at the top, and if there is any other elements which are starting from the same position as header, they will always come underneath it, just like our main section currently is. But to make it always the case, we have to define a property called z-index for this header section and give it value 100 or some higher value. So z-index is 100. But now the problem is that our main section still starts from the top left corner. So we have to somehow bring this main section down and start it where our header section ends. So the quick fix to this problem is, if we give some margin to this main section such that that margin is as high as the total height occupied by this header section, this will bring down the actual main section and it will start off right after the header section. So let's go to the main section and give it some margin. So we are interested in margin top. Since our header section contains 2 children and each of them occupies 8% of viewing height, so that means 16% of viewing height will bring our main section down. So rather than giving it 16, let's give it 20 section of viewing height, so that we can be certain that our main section is actually starting after the header section and it's not being overlapped by the header section. Okay, brilliant. So now we can clearly see that this is the point from where our main section starts, and since our main section is at its proper place, so this brings the footer section at the proper place as well. So now we can remove this color, and we should also decrease the margin from 20 to, let's first make it 18 and see the effect. Okay, 16 is fine. Brilliant. Now before working on the logic to bring on the banner, let's remove this temporary color. Okay. Now finally we can work on the banner section. Now this banner is also a dynamic banner. That means we haven't defined all of these pictures in our HTML. They all are dynamic. We request it from the backend, and not only this image but also these contents that you see, that you can see over here, the title and description, they are all coming from the backend as well. So basically we have to define a table in our database where we will store all this information plus the link to this image, and once we get this data from the backend, we will display it in the banner section that we are going to define in the main section dynamically through our JavaScript. The other thing that you must have mentioned, that this banner is actually a slider. So as you can see, these arrows, this left and right arrow and these pagination links, this whole logic is basically coming from the slider that we are using. So the simplest slider that we have used is a JavaScript based slider, and it's called swiper slider. The reason for choosing this slider is that there are many different sliders available, but most of them are dependent on some kind of libraries. Swiper is one of the most basic sliders which doesn't depend on any external library. So basically we have to include the CDN link for the swiper, and then we simply have to use it. We don't have to install any other library if you want to use this swiper slider. Let's click on getting started, and there are different ways through which you can integrate this swiper slider in your HTML or in your project. So the method that I'm choosing is this CDN paste. So basically I have to copy this link and insert it in the head section of the index.html page. Let's go up and let's paste it over here. Now we have linked swiper slider CDN link with our project. Now let's go back to swiper slider and let's look at what we need to further do. So these are the contents that we need to add to our HTML where we want to add the swiper slider. So these three divs, they are going to act as slides in the slider. So that means the image that we want to behave as a slider or slide, you have to give it class name slide, and these all divs should be wrapped around another div which is called swiper wrapper. So that means this part is mandatory, and beside this part there is another div which is called swiper pagination, and then we have two more divs, swiper button previous and swiper button next, and we have one more div, swiper scroll bar. But all of these divs are optional. For example, if you want to have pagination in your project, this one, these blue dots that you can see, so these dots, they represent pagination. So if you want to display this pagination icons, then you should include that other div as well, this one. If you are not interested in that pagination, then you can remove it. Likewise, the previous and next buttons, these two buttons, they are being displayed over here because I have included these two divs as well. I haven't included this swiper scroll bar, so it's not available. And if you notice, all these things are inside another top level div which is called swiper. So this is the structure that we have to define in our project. But since our slides are going to come from the backend dynamically through JavaScript, therefore we will not be defining this part. We will have a div called swiper. Within this div, we will have an empty div called swiper wrapper, and we will be populating this swiper wrapper with the divs with the class name swiper slide dynamically. Then besides the swiper wrapper div, we will have another div called swiper pagination and these two divs as well. So let's go and define this structure in our index.html file. So let's go down. Where is our main section? There it is. Now within this main, we are going to define 3 sections. One section is going to represent banner, another section is going to represent featured, and third one is going to represent new arrivals. So currently we are working on the banner section. So let's define this section and give it a class name banner. Now within this banner div, we have to define a div with the class name wrapper. And within this wrapper, we have to define 3 divs. One for the slide, one for the pagination, and one for the previous and next buttons. So swiper slide is one div. Then another div, swiper hyphen pagination. And 2 more divs, swiper button previous and swiper button next. We don't need to define anything for these divs. This div, however, the swiper slider div, is supposed to contain, this is swiper wrapper, and within this div we are supposed to have different divs, and each of them should have a class named swiper slide, and each slide is going to represent one banner image along with the text contents on the screen. But since we are going to define them dynamically, so we are going to leave it empty. This is wrap, and this is not wrapper, it's just swiper. So the first top level class is swiper, and inside that we have swiper wrapper, swiper pagination, swiper button previous, swiper button next divs. Now let's go to our MySQL workbench and define a table in our database which is going to provide all the information related to these banners. Since we have eShop selected already, now we can create a table. Right click, create table. Let's give it a class name banner. Let's define ID field, int primary not null, auto increment. Then name, let's keep it varchar45, it can't be null. Then third field is going to be description. Let's make it varchar255. So we can't have a lot of text there. We should have enough space for the text to describe the banner properly. Now again, it can't be null, and let's define the image field which is going to contain the address where our image exists. Let's make it 255 as well. It can't be null either. We need one more field for the status, such that if we set it to 0, then that banner should not be displayed on the browser. It can't be null, and the default is 0. Okay, let's create this field, a table. So there is spelling mistake in the status, so let's cancel it and fix this. Okay. Now we have a table created. Let's put some data in it. Let's give it name Easter sale more than 50% off. Status, let's set it to 1. And image, the path is starting from the root folder. We have a folder named images, and in there we have a folder named banner, then banner2.png. This one row. Now let's Christmas sale. Amazing Christmas sale. Images, banner, let's make it banner3.png, and status is 1. Then for the third row, New Year sale. Must have New Year stuff. Images, banner, banner4.png. Set status to 1 as well. Summer sale. Get summer clothing. Images, banner5.png. Let's set status to active as well. Oh, I have written the Christmas column. Christmas sale, never had before. Images, banner5.png. Let's set status to 1. Or let's set status to 0. So let's make it winter clothing, new winter arrivals, images, banner, benefit art, and 6 of PNG, and let's set status to 1. Okay, now let's create those tables by clicking apply, finish. Now we have 5 fields, but one of the banners have status set to 0, so we should be able to display 4 images in the banner slider on our index.html page. Now let's go and work on the JavaScript which makes the request to our backend to get this banner data. So let's go to our JavaScript file, which is global.css, and since we want this request to be made at the time of page being loaded, just like the request for the categories, so we are going to attach another event listener for the event DOM content loaded. So let's copy this, paste it over here. Now in the second event listener, we are sending a request to bring back categories data, banners data, request banners, and this request is also going to make a fetch request. So what I'm gonna do is that I'm going to copy this function as well, copy, paste. Now let's go and change this function's name from request categories to request banners. Now we have to change the URL endpoint because this time another file is going to serve us, which is going to be banner.php. Now this banner.php and menu.php, these are different endpoints which are serving us different resources. So when we are using this endpoint, menu.php, then we are being served a resource from the database table category. So any data that we are being served from a database table, that data or that database table is called resource at the front end. So at the front end, which appears to us as a resource, is actually a database table at the back end. So this menu in the terminology of REST API is called a resource. And this resource is giving us all the categories that we are displaying in the index.html page as our menu categories. Whereas this second one is giving us another resource called banner, and it's going to give us all the data in the banners database table. Okay, so we change the URL since this is also a get method, so let's keep it that way. And likewise, the response that is going to come from banner.php is going to be in the form of JSON. So the first then block is converting that JSON data into a JavaScript object and returns that JavaScript object as a promise. Then we are using second block, and now we have that response in the form of JavaScript object, and over here we can apply different kind of logic. So for the time being, what we are going to do is that we are commenting this whole logic out. So let's uncomment the last one. Over here, what we are doing, we are just requesting data from the database and displaying it in the console. Then we will figure out how can we organize it and append it in our index.html page. So that's why I have commented this part out. Now let's go and define this banner.php file at the backend. So in our backend folder, we have to define a file named banner.php. So the top part for this banner.php is going to be the same as the top part for the menu.php. So I'm copying these 4 lines and pasting it in the banner.php. So basically over here, we are as usual requiring our database connectivity file so that we have access to our database through that connection object. Then we are telling this that you are supposed to serve any request no matter where it comes from, and then we are checking if the request that has come is it of type HTTP GET request. If that is the case, then we are going to serve it. And again, what are we serving it? We are again going to select everything from, so we are going to have almost the same logic. So rather than just bringing the name of the category, we will take everything whose status is 1, and the database table in this case is banner rather than category. So we have to do some minor changes over here. So what I'm going to do is that I'm copying everything and inserting in the banner.php's if method. Paste. Now let's go and start make changes. So instead of just requesting name, we are selecting everything from not category table, rather banner table where status equals 1. Then we are executing this statement and if this result variable contains data set or result set, then this won't be false, and then we can get inside the if block. Then we are creating an empty array and we are saying while. Now this time let's remove this name because we are interested in whole row that comes from the database, and since it's a row, we are changing the variable name from name to row, or let's make it row array because it's an array now. So what this while loop is doing, it's going to get one row at a time from the result variable and applying the fetch assoc method on it, which converts that row into an associative array, and that array is being stored in this variable named row array. Now we are pushing this row array into this empty array that was over here we just created. So row array. Now this array is being populated with all the rows which are being fetched from the result set that has been received from the database. Now the data that we are sending, we have to change the index name from categories to banners, and we are providing the whole array that we have been populating with each row that we received from the database table. If something goes wrong, means if the statement doesn't execute, in that case this else block will execute and it will inform the user or the front end that something went wrong. Now let's go to the browser and we should be able to see banner related data in the console. Let's refresh and open developers tools. Okay, we have received an object, and an object contains a property named banner, and this property has as its value an array which contains 4 elements. At index 0 we have an object whose ID is 1, name is Easter sale, this is the URL of the image, and this is the status. And if you notice, we have got ID 1, 2, 3 and 4 ID. ID 4 is missing because we set its status value to 0, so that's why it hasn't been returned. Now all we need to do is that we have to display this information as a banner over here in our index.html page. Now to display what is being displayed in the console as a banner images on our HTML page, let's remove everything. And the first thing that we should do over here in our global.js file over here is, first of all, we have to make sure that we have actually received banners. So if data.banners, then we can be sure that we have actually received banners and not an error message. So now we can define the logic over here. So basically what we want to do is that we are going to create divs with the class name swiper slide, this over here. So now we are going to iterate through these banners. So let's create a variable called banners and assign this data.banner so that we don't have to write each time data.banners. Now we have to iterate through this banners array. Now this for each takes an arrow function. So we are going to pass one banner at a time to this arrow function, and over here we are going to define all the logic which is associated with this banner. So the first thing is that we have to create a div with the class name swiper slide and attach that banner image into that div as a background. So const slide document.create element div slide.class name equals swiper slide. Now within this swiper wrapper div, we are appending swiper slide divs to your JavaScript. So over here we are creating a div and we are assigning a class named swiper slide. Next what we are going to do is that we are going to attach this image as the background for this div. So slide.style.background image. Now for this background image we are going to use URL function, and we will be using the URL from this banner object. So we are going to use a string interpolation, and to use a string interpolation we have to use these backticks. So these backticks allow us to use a variable name as a string interpolation. So first of all we have to use URL function, and within this URL function we have to provide the quotation marks because now we are going to provide the URL. So this URL is going to come from this banner object. So this banner object has different properties, and one of the property is image. this property. So we have to target this property. So the banner object that we have received, it has these different properties: ID, name, description, image, and status. So we are currently targeting this image property because it contains the URL where our image is. But this URL is not a complete URL. It only contains from the root, the path from the root folder. So we have to attach the domain name to it as well. So http localhost :8081. This is where the server is running. Then from here we have to attach the string interpolation. So $ square brackets, and within these square brackets we have to use banner.image. Now this banner.image contains /images/banner and then the name of the banner file. Now we have attached this image as a background to this div, but as we know that this div is currently empty, that means it's not occupying any space in the browser. So if it's currently empty, it doesn't have contents. This image is serving as a background. It's not the contents of the image. So therefore, we won't be able to see this image. In order to be able to see this image, this background image, either this div should have some contents in it, or the other option is that we have to assign certain fixed height to it, so that even if the div is empty, it will still occupy a certain amount of area on the browser. So that's what we are going to do. Slide.style height, and let's give it 20% of viewing height for the time being. Let's put it in quotations. Now before we go and have a look in the browser, we have to attach this div, this slide div, to the banner. So I'm temporarily attaching it as the last child to this banner, just to be certain that we are able to see the image in the browser. Later on we have to change that. So const banner section document.query selector, and the class name was banner. Now banner section dot append child, append will also do, and we have to append this slide as its last child. Now let's go and have a look in the browser that if we are able to see this banner in the browser. Okay, so this is how they currently look. Since I have only assigned 20% of viewing height, that's why we can only see the small portion of an image. And the other problem is that, as you can see, the image is being repeated. So we have to increase the height, and then we have to set a property such that the image is not being repeated. So let's go and do that. So let's make it 45% of viewing height, and then slide.style.background size equals cover. This is better. Now as you can see that these are not being displayed as sliders. So now we have to define the logic which makes them display as slider, and then we will figure out how to put the text and the shop button over each of these images. So let's go and make them sliders first. And to make them sliders, now we have to define the last remaining part that is needed to make some divs into a sliders. So to do that, we have to initialize this swiper in JavaScript file. So we have to create an instance of a class named swiper. This swiper class is going to come from the CDN that we have linked in our head section of index.html. So we are passing in the class name of the div, the swiper div, and over here we have to define certain properties. So we will not be using this property, we will be defining this property, because this way, once we have displayed all the images, if there are 4 images and 4 images have been displayed as slide, when you click on the next button, we will see the first image again. So there is going to be this loop of these images. Then since we have also used pagination, so we will be using this as well. And likewise for the navigation, we are going to use this one, but we are not including this one because we haven't used the scroll bar. So since we are bringing in the contents for the slider dynamically, so we have to make sure we define this dynamically as well. So where should we define them? What we are going to do is that we are going to define a function called carousel, because this slider is also called carousel. And and over here we are defining, and over here we have to define the logic that has been given in the swiper slider web page. So what I'm going to do is that I'm simply copying it and pasting it over here. Since we haven't used the scroll bar, so let's delete this part. We don't need this direction to be vertical. Okay, now let's go up where we are defining this. Now instead of appending these slides in the banner section directly, we have to append them in the swiper wrapper class. So let's change this to swiper wrapper and change the class name to swiper wrapper as well, and append these slides to this swiper wrapper. Copy and paste it over here. Now we need to call this function, call carousel, outside this for each loop, and let's hope we are able to see those images as the sliders. Okay, we can see at least this arrow, forward one, but not the previous one. So most likely we have made spelling mistake in the index.html page. Yeah, the P is missing. Brilliant. Okay, now we can see these images. Now what I'm going to do is that I'm going to change these images to the one that we have in the demo project, and then we'll figure out how to display the text over here as well. So let me go and change the images in the database table. Okay, now I have changed the images, and we can see the proper images that we have in the demo project as well. Okay, now we have to figure out how can we display the text that we can see in the demo project. This one. So this is the name in our database table, and this is the description. And then with each banner we have this button which we can click and go to some other place where we can do shopping. So currently I have attached this button with the index.html page. So it will take us back to index.html page. But of course, if it was not a proof of concept kind of demo project, then we would have placed the proper URL for the link where this banner should take us. Anyways, now let's go and figure out how can we display these in the center of each banner. So to do that, we again have to go back to the for each loop, and after setting all the properties for the background image, now let's define a h3 element. And let's set its text contents to banner.name. So the name field from the banner object is going to be displayed as h3's text contents. Then we have to define a paragraph where we are going to display the description contents of each banner. Now we have to create a button. And set its text contents to shop now. Now we have three elements that we have created. Now we have to attach these elements to this div, the slide div. Slide.append child, the first child is h3, then slide.append child, the second child is paragraph, and finally slide.append child, the third child is the button. Okay, we can see everything over here. Now we have to bring them in the center, so we are going to do this styling through our CSS file. So let's go to our CSS file, and since this banner is inside the main section, but so where does our main ends? Over here. section starts. And banner section ends. Now over here, the class that we are targeting is .swiper slide. We have to set its display to flex. Now setting the display property to flex will bring all the contents in single row, so we have to set its flex direction to be column, justify content center, and align item center. Now that's better. Now we have to convert it into this. So let's figure out how to give it this look. So the first property that comes immediately to the mind is that we have to set its color to white. Then if you notice, this text has shadow attached as well. This one, and the size is slightly bigger as well, and besides that we have some margin as well. So let's go and do that. Let's define color to be white. Let's increase font size to rem. That's better. Now let's give it text shadow. So the first value for that is a horizontal shadow, which is 2 pixels, and for the vertical shadow again 2 pixels. For the blur I am going to use 3 pixels, and for the color let's give it primary color. Okay, that's better. We need to increase some margin bottom. So that is going to be applied to all the children of this swiper slide. So copy, paste, and then asterisk means all the children of this swiper slide. Let's give it margin bottom. Let's give it 0.8 rem and see its effect. Okay, that's better. Now we have to work on this shop button. So again, since this button is one of the children in the swiper slide div, so it has the same color as primary color, and the font size is even bigger. So background color is primary color, font size is 2.5 rem. I think that's too much. Let's make it 1.5 rem. Now give it padding. Top and bottom, let's make it 5 pixels. Left and right 10 pixels. Okay, not bad. Now let's give it smooth edges and remove this border. So border bottom, for the smooth edges 5 pixels. Outline is none, so it's not border bottom, it's border radius. For the border color, let's give it same color as the border background. Okay, that's better. Now I have given this one the text as different color as well, and it has slightly higher padding, but for this project I am keeping it this way. We are done with today's target as well. So we have created this footer and we have created this banner. In the next episode we will work on bringing the actual products and displaying them over here as well. So until then, enjoy this episode and please don't forget to like, subscribe, comment and share. Thank you so much.